close your eyes and imagine a landscape carved by ice and iron. In the far north of Minnesota, near the western tip of Lake Superior, lies a small city built on the richest deposit of iron ore in the world. The sky is often a pale, pearly gray, and in the deep winter months the snow piles up around the wooden houses until they look like ships frozen in a white sea. It is here, in Hibbing, that a boy named Robert Allen Zimmerman came into the world on May 24, 1941. His father ran a furniture store and his mother kept a warm kitchen, but the world outside was one of frost on window panes and the distant rumble of ore trains. The light in winter was a soft blue that seemed to hold everything still. This was the landscape that shaped his earliest dreams, a place where silence and vast open spaces taught a child to listen. Walk down the main street of Hibbing in the mid-1940s. The brick buildings are low and sturdy, built by the mining companies, and the streetlights glow with a gentle amber halo against the falling snow. A small boy with curly hair walks alone to the movie theater where he will sit in the dark and watch films about cowboys and wanderers. Later, he will tell people that he ran away from home more than once, following the carnival when it left town, mesmerized by the strange music and the tattered caravans. But for now, he simply walks, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The world is quiet, the shops are closing, and the only sounds are the crunch of his boots on packed snow and the distant cry of a train whistle. This sense of movement, of somewhere else just over the horizon, is already taking root in his heart. The house on 7th Avenue was a modest two-story home with a porch and a small yard. Inside, the radio was always on. At night, the boy would lie in his bed and turn the dial, catching signals from faraway places. The voices of country singers, blues musicians, and gospel preachers floated through the static, carrying with them stories of love, loss, and redemption. He heard Hank Williams, Muddy Waters, and the Carter Family. Even then, he was collecting sounds, storing them in his memory like pebbles from a riverbed. The light from the radio dial cast a faint green glow on his bedroom wall, and as he listened, the borders of his small town began to dissolve. In his mind, he was already traveling down a long dirt road, headed toward a world that he could not yet name. Summers in Hibbing were brief, but beautiful. The snow melted, and suddenly the landscape turned green and gold. The boy and his friends would ride bicycles past the enormous open-pit iron mines, gazing down into the terraced red earth that looked like a wound in the planet. But to a child, it was simply a wonder, a canyon of rust-colored cliffs where tiny trucks moved like insects far below. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and the sunsets over the mines stretched orange and pink across the sky. It was a strange kind of paradise, one where industry and nature existed side by side. This contrast, the raw earth and the delicate light, would later appear in his songwriting like a half-remembered dream. When he was still in grade school, the boy discovered the piano and then the guitar. He had small, nimble fingers and an ear that could capture a melody after hearing it just once. His first musical performances were at school talent shows, where he played folk songs and rock and roll tunes with a nervous energy. During those moments, standing on a wooden stage under a single spotlight, he felt a shift inside himself. The applause was like a warm wind, and the music seemed to lift him out of his own skin. His parents watched from the audience, proud and a little confused by the passion that burned behind their son's quiet eyes. When the show ended, he would step out into the cool evening air, the stars sharp and bright above Minnesota, and he knew that music was the path he would follow. In high school, he formed several short-lived bands. They played covers of Little Richard and Elvis Presley, filling the school gymnasium with echoing, joyful noise. The boy had already changed his name, telling friends he was Bobby Dylan after the poet Dylan Thomas, though later he would spin different tales. He was searching for a mask, or perhaps a mirror, that could show the world who he wanted to be. The yearbook of 1959 shows a serious young man with a slight smile, ambition hidden behind a teenage slouch. Around him, the hallways were filled with the scent of floor wax and chalk dust, and the late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows over rows of lockers. It was a time of quiet preparation, like the slow gathering of clouds before a gentle rain. When he graduated, he left Hibbing for the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. The city was a revelation: streetcars clanging, bookstores with dusty windows, coffee houses where young people argued about philosophy and poetry. He began to explore the beatnik subculture, growing his hair long and wearing dark sunglasses even indoors. At a small folk club called the 10 O'Clock Scholar, he sat in a corner and watched performers sing old ballads. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the lights were low and golden. Here, he discovered the recordings of Woody Guthrie, and something inside him cracked wide open. Guthrie's voice was rough as gravel, but his songs were full of compassion for ordinary people. That winter, the young man made a decision. He would go east, to New York, the heart of the folk revival. The day he left, fresh snow was falling on the Minneapolis streets, quiet and relentless, as if the city itself was tucking him in for a long, transformative journey. Now, picture the Hibbing of today, still standing under the same vast sky. The mining pits are deeper, the trees around them taller, but the light has not changed. It remains a landscape of slowness and silence, a place where a child can listen to the wind and imagine far-off cities. The boy who left all those decades ago, carrying a guitar and a handful of borrowed names, would one day become a voice heard around the world. But the frozen earth of Minnesota never left him. It stayed in the grain of his voice, in the imagery of cold highways and lonely train whistles that run through his songs like winter rivers. And on quiet nights, when the northern lights dance green and ghostly above the Iron Range, one can almost hear a harmonica playing softly, blown by a boy who is still there, dreaming of the road. The bus from Minnesota rolled into New York City in the cold January of 1961. Robert Zimmerman stepped onto the pavement of the Port Authority terminal wearing a thin jacket and carrying a battered suitcase. He was 19 years old, and the city rose around him like a forest of concrete and brick, every window reflecting the weak winter sunlight. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, car exhaust, and damp wool. He made his way downtown to Greenwich Village, a neighborhood of narrow cobblestone streets and low-rise buildings that seemed to lean together for warmth. Here, he found a world that pulsed with music and poetry. The trees in Washington Square Park were bare, their branches tracing delicate patterns against the gray sky, but inside the coffee houses, it was always warm and golden, like stepping into a painting by an old master. He first slept on the floors of kind strangers, learned the rhythm of the village by walking its streets for hours. McDougal Street ran south from the park, lined with brick facades and iron fire escapes, and at number 117 was a basement club called the Gaslight. You ducked your head down a narrow staircase into a room lit only by candles stuck into empty wine bottles. The ceiling was low, the tables rough-hewn, and the stage was just a small wooden platform where one person with a guitar could command the entire room. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of spilled coffee, and when a performer played, the audience fell into a hush so complete you could hear the wax dripping down the bottle. It was in rooms like this that the young man, now calling himself Bob Dylan for good, would carve out his first fragile reputation. In those early weeks, he visited his idol Woody Guthrie at the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey. Woody was sick with Huntington's disease, his body frail but his eyes still bright. Bob would sit by the bed and play Guthrie's own songs back to him, the simple melodies filling the sterile room with a gentle, living warmth. Sometimes Woody would tap his fingers on the blanket and hum along. The afternoon light fell through the window in soft, dusty beams, illuminating the young man's face as he sang. It was a passing of the torch, quiet and sacred, like the changing of light at dusk. Bob left those visits carrying a deeper understanding of what a song could do. It could travel across time, comfort the suffering, and keep alive the spirit of a man whose body was failing. Back in the village, he began to write his own songs. He would sit in his tiny apartment on West 4th Street, a guitar on his knee and a notebook on the windowsill, and watch the street below. The fire escape cast a lacy shadow on the brick wall, and the sounds of the city, distant car horns, children laughing, a radio playing from an open window, would drift up like fragments of a dream. He wrote with the urgency of someone trying to capture smoke, scribbling lines that drew on old folk tunes and the poetry of the French symbolists he was reading in cheap paperbacks. The room was bare, a cot, a chair, a few books. But in his mind, it was filled with landscapes, dusty roads, lonely railroad tracks, a woman with ribbons in her hair standing by a window. The words flowed like water, and each song was a small universe, complete with its own sorrow and its own fragile hope. One evening, a music critic named Robert Shelton happened into Gurd's Folk City on West 3rd Street. The club was warm and crowded, the stage bathed in a soft amber light that made the performers look like figures in a dream. A young man with a rough, untrained voice stepped up to the microphone. He wore a corduroy cap and a shy expression, but when he began to sing, the room grew still. Shelton listened, spellbound. The next day, he wrote a review for the New York Times that described a new voice in folk music, one that seemed to carry all the weariness and wonder of America inside it. The review was like a key turning in a lock. Soon after, the record producer John Hammond listened to the young man and offered him a contract with Columbia Records. It all happened quietly, without fanfare, like the first snowflake that begins an avalanche. The recording sessions for his first album took place in a cavernous studio on East 30th Street, a converted church where the ceiling soared high above the microphones. Bob stood in the middle of the room with his guitar, the engineers hidden behind glass panels, and played the songs he had carried with him from Minnesota and learned in the village. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that floated in the air. He sang old ballads and a couple of his own early pieces, his voice wavering slightly, still finding its character. The tape reels turned slowly, capturing not just music but a moment of pure, unpolished becoming. When he walked out of the studio into the cool evening, the city lights were just beginning to glow, and he carried under his arm a copy of his first record, still warm from the pressing. The village continued to be his home, his laboratory. In the mornings, he might walk to an Italian cafe on Bleecker Street, order black coffee, and read the newspaper. The waiter would nod, knowing to leave him alone with his thoughts. Outside the cafe window, early morning light painted the brick walls a soft pink, and the delivery trucks rattled over the cobblestones. It was a time of gathering, of observing. He watched the old women in their patterned scarves, the children skipping rope on the sidewalk, the artists setting up easels in the park. All of it was material, the raw texture of life that he would later weave into his lyrics. The neighborhood itself was like an old folk song, passed down and remade by each new arrival, and he was beginning to understand his own small place within it. And so, as the winter turned to spring and the trees in the park put out their first green leaves, Bob Dylan stood at a threshold. The shy boy from the Iron Range had become a young man with a record deal and a growing reputation. But fame was not yet in the room. Only the music was there, along with the soft, constant hum of the city, a sound that was both a comfort and a promise. At night, lying on his narrow bed, he could hear the distant murmur of the village, a guitar playing in another apartment, footsteps on the stairs, the clinking of glasses from the bar downstairs. The sounds wove together like the strands of a melody, and as sleep crept over him, he could feel new songs already forming in the darkness, waiting for the morning light. The year 1962 arrived quietly in New York, unrolling like a scroll of gray and pale blue. Bob Dylan was 20 years old, still living in the village, still writing in his notebooks by the dim glow of a desk lamp. That winter, he found himself spending long hours in a room on West 4th Street with the shades drawn, filling page after page with words that felt less like songs and more like prophecies. He had fallen in love with the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud and the beat writers, and their spirit crackled through his pen. The world outside was tense, full of talk of missiles and marches, but inside that small room there was only the scratch of ink and the soft hum of a radiator. One afternoon, he picked up his guitar and tried to fit a melody to a phrase that had been circling in his mind, How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? The question hung in the air, gentle and immense, like a cloud that would soon bring much-needed rain. The song that grew from that question was "Blowin' in the Wind." He played it first for a few friends in a cafe, his voice gentle and conversational, as if he were sharing a secret. The melody was old, borrowed from a spiritual his ancestors might have sung, but the words were brand new, and they landed with a quiet, devastating clarity. He recorded the song in a studio on a spring day, the windows open to let in the fresh air, and the engineer captured the sound of his guitar strings trembling slightly as he played. When the track was pressed onto vinyl and released, it seemed to float across the country like a dandelion seed, touching down in folk clubs and college dorm rooms, in kitchens and on porches. People began to listen more closely. They realized that this young man was not just singing about the world, he was describing a world that could be. His second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, appeared in the shops in May 1963. The cover photograph, taken on a snowy Jones Street in the Village, shows Bob and his girlfriend Susie Rotolo walking arm in arm, bundled in winter coats, their breath visible in the cold air. It is an image of tender intimacy, two young people holding on to each other on a quiet street. The light is soft and diffuse, the snow clinging to the pavement, and the whole scene feels suspended in time. That photograph became an icon not because of grand gestures, but because of its stillness. Inside the sleeve, the songs were just as intimate, stories of love, of wandering, of injustice, all told in a voice that sounded wise beyond its years. The album was a quiet revolution, a turning of the soil, and it planted seeds that would grow for decades. That same year, Bob was invited to perform at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On a warm August morning, he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gazed out at a sea of faces that stretched all the way to the Washington Monument. The sun was bright, the sky a clear, perfect blue, and the marble of the memorial glowed white and hot. He sang only a few songs, but when his harmonica sounded across the National Mall, it seemed to weave through the crowd like a thread of silver. Later, he would recall not the vastness of the moment, but the small details, a woman fanning herself with a paper program, a child asleep on a parent's shoulder, the way the sound echoed slightly off the stone. It was history, but it was also simply a day, with its own gentle rhythms and ordinary warmth. Away from the crowds and the protests, Bob continued his life of quiet rituals. In the mornings, he might walk along the Hudson River, watching the cargo ships move slowly against the current, their horns sounding low and mournful. The piers were old and weathered, though silvered by years of sun and rain. He would find a bench and sit for a while, the city's skyline a distant silhouette behind a veil of haze. These solitary moments were essential. They allowed his mind to settle, to sift through the images and phrases that crowded his imagination. He always carried a small notebook in the pocket of his jacket, its pages filled with crossed-out lines and tiny drawings. Writing, for him, was not about declaration. It was about listening, to the water, to the wind, to the low murmur of strangers passing by. His relationship with Susie Rotolo was a central theme of this period. She was an artist and a political activist, and she introduced him to new books, new ideas, the paintings of the Italian Renaissance, and the poetry of the French decadence. Their love was intense and fragile, like a flame in a drafty room. They shared a tiny apartment where the bookcases overflowed and the kitchen smelled of coffee and oil paint. In the evenings, they would sit on the rooftop, watching the sun set over the water tanks and the chimneys, the sky turning tangerine and lavender. Many of his most tender love songs from this era, and also his most bitter laments, were shaped by the joy and the pain of their time together. The end of a relationship became, in his hands, a landscape, a desolate highway, a falling leaf, an empty room where a photograph still hangs on the wall. As his fame grew, strangers began to approach him on the street, asking for autographs or offering praise. He did not always feel comfortable with this attention. He would pull his cap lower over his eyes and walk a little faster. The cafes he once frequented became crowded with people hoping to catch a glimpse of him. In response, he withdrew deeper into his music. He bought a typewriter and began working on a novel, piling up pages of surreal, fragmented prose that he would later plunder for song lyrics. The late afternoons found him at the typewriter, the keys clacking softly, a single lamp illuminating the page. Outside the window, the lights of the village began to glow, and the rhythm of the streets shifted from day to night. He was now a public figure, but he was still, at heart, the quiet boy who watched movies alone in the Hibbing dark. And what of the songs? They were accumulating like snow on a branch. A hard rain's gonna fall, masters of war, don't think twice, it's all right. Each one was a complete world, vivid with color and shadow. Critics began to use the word genius, but Bob dismissed it. He would sit on a stool in a club, the audience leaning forward, and he would sing these new songs in his nasal voice, the guitar picking out delicate patterns. The light on the stage was always soft, a warm amber that made his halo of hair glow. Between songs, he would mumble or grin or sip from a glass of water. The performance was not a spectacle, it was an offering, a shared silence between the artist and the crowd. As the months passed, he could feel a change coming, a restlessness that he did not yet understand. But for now, in the village, in 1963, he was still the poet who asked the questions, and the world was leaning closer to hear the answers.